Now, there are intensified diplomatic efforts to avert any conflict in Ukraine, which is tens of thousands of Russian troops massed along the border. French President Emmanuel Macron, he's going to travel to Moscow later on Monday for talks with Vladimir Putin. Mr. Macron says a deal is still possible. Our correspondent, Caroline Davies, has more on the talks in Moscow.
I think the fact that there are still some level of diplomatic talks going on is, of course, incredibly important, given that there are rising tensions about Ukraine. And as long as these conversations keep going, I think the West feels like there is hope of what in diplomatic terms is quite often called an off-ramp, a way of de-escalating this situation. But in terms of what we're actually expecting from the meeting between President Putin and Macron today, I don't think we're going to get some form of absolute resolution that this sort of situation will be completely resolved. But of course, President Macron has been relatively positive about this. He's talked about the fact that he thinks there is still the possibility of a deal. He's talked about the fact that it's legitimate for Russia to talk about its security concerns, but at the same time, it's crucially important to preserve the security and the sovereignty of Ukraine. This is the difficult balance that Western leaders are trying to strike at the moment. They're trying to keep Russia at the diplomatic table, but at the same time sound firm about what they need out of the situation.
And has Mr. Macron hinted at all of what that possible deal might look like?
Well, I think we know a little bit about what NATO, the US, the West's stance is towards Russia, about what it's willing to negotiate on and what it's not. To start with what it's not, it's, of course, NATO expansion. Now, Russia, President Putin have made it very clear that one of their key security demands is that they do not want NATO to expand any further. They don't want any more countries to join the NATO alliance, but particularly they don't want Ukraine to join that alliance. However, the US and NATO have been absolutely adamant that they don't want to have any third country having a say over who gets to join NATO or not, and they continue with the open door policy. So that is not on the table. However, we do know that there are certain things that the US did suggest to Russia. That was when they provided their responses to Russia's demands, which were made back in December, if you can sort of follow the timeline. And some of those elements include sort of discussions about missile deployment, about checking missiles on both sides as well. These are all sort of lower level confidence building measures that I think the West is hoping that Russia might make some movement on. However, we still haven't had a Russian response to those US responses about exactly what they're planning to do next. They've talked about the importance of continuing with diplomacy, but at the same time, they've also said that the key Russian security demands were not answered by the West at the moment. So in terms of where we're going to be able to find some diplomatic solution, it's still not certain. Russia, of course, continues to maintain that it has no plans to invade Ukraine. But in terms of where we get a de-escalation, we just don't know yet.